I'm grateful the elders have asked me to speak this morning. We'll try to be an individual who glorifies God in a meaningful way. Before we get to the lesson, and you ought to be turning to Proverbs Chapter 3, verses 3 and 4. While you're doing that, I want to make a statement about some of the conversation that I've heard within the congregation. We've known of this church for 20 plus years, my wife, my family, and I. And good people here. But I've heard conversation over the last couple of weeks that says this congregation or this church is in transition. And that is true within some context. But it's also not necessarily accurate because this congregation is not in transition. At least in 3 of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Christ takes the time to have a conversation with his disciples, and he asks them, "Who do men say that I am?" And the response is, well, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you might be Elijah, others say you might be Jeremiah, or you could be one of the other prophets. And Jesus says, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter responds by saying, "You are the Christ, the living Son of God." And he is the one who is on the throne. He's the monarch of this congregation. He rules this congregation. This is his bride. He will protect his bride and take care of his bride. And so there's nothing fundamentally that has changed about this church from 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago or 5 weeks ago. You were redeemed the way you were redeemed. You have faith in the one you have faith in. You're called to walk a certain walk and talk a certain talk. And none of that has changed. Now, what has changed and what is in transition is the way that God is using some of his resources. That's what's changing. I think, Sonny, you were one of the first elders of this congregation along with Sam Ballacino. Sonny's still with us leading singing. Sam has gone to get his reward. Well done, good and faithful servant. That's where Sam's at. And God has relocated resources or reallocated resources to serve in a different way. And that is what's happening here. We've seen Flo Mata and John Rowe moved to Colorado. Sam Bradley sitting back. Sam and Jill. My goodness, Sam has served as an elder back there. And if there's ever a Christian gentleman, it would certainly be Sam, and what a lovely wife. But you know, Sam still teaches and takes care of us just like he always had, even though he doesn't serve as an elder, a proper elder. And so God uses resources and redeploys resources and calls some resources home. Last Sunday morning while we were driving to church, Forey Grove, who was the longtime minister of Texas A&M Church of Christ, some of you may know him, he was in the school of preaching the year before me. He was in the class before me. He graduated while I was there. Wonderful student of the Word. Him and Ken could be brothers as it relates to study habits and understanding the Word. He was called home last Sunday morning. See, he got redeployed. He got relocated. And so that happens from time to time. But the Prince of Peace, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, still owns this church, and he owns your soul. We don't have a chief elder. We don't have a CEO elder. We have a king who rules this congregation. And these elders serve in spiritual matters. Their job is spiritual matters, to help us grow spiritually and to be better at the walk that we're called to walk. And so that's good news. That's good news that there's a stability, there's an undercurrent, there's a scaffolding that never ever changes for those who have faith in Lord God Almighty. So now, let's take a look at Proverbs Chapter 3, but I want to set a little bit of a historical context for you before we get right to that proverb. You know, if you have attended church much at all, you know about Abraham and Sarah. And the story starts in Genesis chapter 3, and we always say there was a threefold promise made to Abraham. There were 3 promises made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, and it's stated again in chapter 17, in chapter 18, and chapter 22. It's repeated multiple times. It's repeated to his descendants. And the promise was simply, the 3 promises were simply, number 1, I am going to build of you a very great nation. And it says that when you look at the sands of the seas, you're not going to be able to count the number of people in your nation. You look at the stars of heaven, you won't be able to number them. It's going to be one big nation. Promise number 2 is I'm going to take that people, that nation, and I'm going to give you a land flowing with milk and honey. You're going to live in houses you did not build, and you're going to reap from vineyards and crops that you did not plant. Meaning, I'm going to go in and displace the inhabitants of the land, and you're going to live in their houses, and you're going to take advantage of their crops. And the third promise that came along was that in your seed, Abraham, all nations will be blessed. Now, I don't think that Abraham understood what that meant for one moment, but we know from the New Testament that that third promise pointed directly and accurately at Jesus Christ for every man to be blessed through redemption. Well, Abraham and Sarah didn't have any children, though, and here we have this threefold promise going on. How is he going to build a nation without children? How is everybody in the world going to be blessed without seed? And so when Abraham's about 100 years old and Sarah's about 90 years old, they have a child named Isaac. Now, the thought of me having children in my later years in life is as frightening as it can be. I can imagine what it was like for Abraham and Sarah. But they have a young son, and they're told to call his name Isaac. And then Isaac marries a lady named Rebekah, and they have some children. They have 2 children named Jacob and Esau. And through some trickery, Esau was the elder, as you recall. Jacob was the younger. And so the blessing should have gone to Esau. The blessing of where this nation was going to come from should have come through Esau. But through some trickery of Mama and of Jacob, the blessing instead gets bestowed upon Jacob. And now Jacob is going to rule over his older brother in the years ahead. And that doesn't set too well, but that is the way it is, because when blessings are given, blessings are kept. Well, then subsequently, Jacob has some children. He marries Leah, who has bad eyes, evidently, the scripture says. I don't know whether they were cross-eyed or she just maybe wasn't very pretty. I don't really know. But probably wouldn't want to marry her either way, because he really, really thought that the other sister was beautiful, and he loved her. He loved that old Rachel to death. Well, through those 2 wives and their concubines, he has 12 children, which ultimately become the 12 tribes of Israel, that are going to be really the tribal heads of this great nation that's going to be built. Of those 12 sons, the one that's next to last, Joseph, he has a couple of dreams, and he goes and shares those visions of those dreams with his brothers and his daddy. And that creates a little bit of a problem, because the emphasis of those dreams says that the younger is going to rule over the older brothers. And man, they hate him. They resent him beyond measure. And they start to plot. They know that their daddy loves him most of all. And so they begin to plot on how they're going to get rid of him. And their first thought is let's murder him. And then we'll lie about it, like every murderer does. And then we'll lie about it. But subsequently, they're provided an alternative path. And at 17 years old, he's sold off to a caravan that ends up selling him into Egyptian bondage in Potiphar's house in Egypt down there. And then through some things that happen, he ends up in prison in Egypt. And he gets out of prison because he seems to have the ability to interpret visions and dreams. And somewhere along in there, Pharaoh has a vision, and anybody in his nation, all of his soothsayers and all of his diviners, they can't no more interpret that vision or that dream than anything in the world. And one remembers that Joseph was able to interpret visions. And so they call old Joseph in there, and Joseph says, I'm going to tell you exactly what it means. By the hand of God, it means there's going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And man, Pharaoh was so thrilled with this young man. He's now 30 years old. He's been in bondage for 13 years. And now Pharaoh was so thrilled with this man, he makes him second in command. There is nobody more powerful in all of Egypt than Joseph. And so for 7 years, Joseph stores up the crops. He handles the taxation of the government. And man, they're prosperous, and the store bins are full beyond measure. And then there's 7 years of famine. Well, Joseph's family is still back over in the other land, his father and his 11 brothers. And they're about to starve to death, and so Daddy sends 10 of the 11 brothers to Egypt to get grain because he knows there's grain down there because Joseph done such a good job. When he arrives, when those 10 brothers arrive, Joseph immediately identifies them as his brother. He knows them, but they don't know him. And so over the course of a number of events that I don't have the time to talk about, Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers, and he relocates his father, his 11 brothers, their wives, and their children to Egypt with the blessing of Pharaoh. And he gives them the best of land. He gives them the land of Goshen. Man, Goshen is one fertile valley. And these boys are shepherds. That's what they do for a living. And they are really good at their job. They're so good at it that Pharaoh says they need to take care of my flocks also. Well, now we're still thinking about Abraham's promise of that great nation and that great land. But do you know that by the time we get to Abraham's great-grandson, Joseph, and he relocates that family to Egypt, do you know how large that nation is? Do you know how many of his relatives show up in Egypt for the land of Goshen? Well, Genesis says there were 70 of them. Acts chapter 7 and verse 1, Stephen says there were 75. Stephen's count, there is a difference between the two, but there were a couple of the grandsons that had died in the wilderness, and you know, Stephen may have counted them, I don't know, but 70 to 75 people was all that the nation was. You know, I grew up in Vernon, Texas, you know that, and right outside of Vernon there's an area called Doan's Crossing. It's where the Chisholm Trail goes through, and I'm part of that Chisholm clan. And we go out there every spring and we celebrate there at Doan's Crossing. There isn't anything there now. It used to be a store where people stop and get wares and stuff, but now there's an oak tree out there, and we go out there and sing that oak tree and make a big deal of it. And there's about 100 of us that show up, 100 of Chisholm folks. So there's more Chisholm folks at Doan's Crossing in the springtime than there were in Egypt when Joseph relocated his family down to Egypt. I bet you've had some family reunions where it's just that way too. There's 100 people there, and you know about 80 of them, maybe 70, maybe 60. Most of the people that show up at our reunions, I don't even know their names. We have to introduce ourselves every year. But nonetheless, this is still a very small family. Now, it also says that Pharaoh that knew Joseph and favored him died, and there was another Pharaoh that rose up that didn't know Joseph. It didn't mean it didn't know him. It just means that he didn't have much regard for him. He probably knew the history of Joseph because, and let me just give you something to think about here, we probably assume that from the time that the Pharaoh that knew Joseph that was in power, and the time that the Pharaoh that came along that didn't know Joseph, we might think that's 1,000 years or 750 years or a long, long time. It has to be a long time for somebody to forget Joseph, right? Well, every scholar says it can't be any more than 300 years, and the number of 300 years has very little scholarly support behind it. It's probably no more than 100 to 150 years from the time that the Pharaoh ruled who knew Joseph to the one that ruled that didn't know Joseph. But he was concerned because this 70 people had become now a large clan of people, and he was concerned that they would rise up in insurrection against Egypt. You might say, well, why in the world be worried about that? Well, Egypt had not been immune from having invasions into Egypt. Upper Egypt would be occupied by foreigners at one time. Lower Egypt would then be taken over. Constant battle through the centuries of insurrectionists coming in, invaders coming in into their country. And so this particular Pharaoh that was now in power decided he didn't want any of that. And so he said, we got to do something about these people because they might be able to rise up and really cause us pain. And so he puts them in bondage. We know that's true. Well, after 430 years of bondage, and through a lot of miraculous powers as it relates to Moses and God's hand, they're brought out of bondage. And we don't know the exact number of how many people came out of there, but 430 years later, we're told in one statement in Exodus that 600 men, 20 years and older, and their wives, approximately 600 men, and their wives and their children leave Egypt. Now, if you multiply it times 3, we get 1.8 million, multiply it times 4, 2.4 million. Scholars tell me that the entire population of Egypt at that time was only about 4 million people. And so by the time that Israel got ready to exodus out of Egypt, They were at least half or more than the size of the population, the entire population of Egypt. I understand why the Pharaoh was worried. And man, God multiplied that nation, multiplied it big. So that's the first number that we have. Now that number is repeated later on in Exodus, where we're told there were 603,550. It's refined. The second year after they exit, there's a census taken. Moses is commanded by God to take a census, and that number is 603,000 plus of just men who are 20 years old and older, not the women and children. And in that particular census, in the second year, the tribe of Levi is not counted. So not all 12 tribes are even counted. Then 38 years later, after this wilderness wandering, and we get all these people slain who didn't have enough faith to go in and possess the land, when the spies came back and discouraged them, there's another census taken, another census commanded by God. And in that census, the number once again is in the 600,000 plus range of men 20 years and old. We have one more data point, and that final data point is a census that was taken by David that you can find in the book of Kings. And that census really wasn't supposed to happen. Satan put it in the heart of Dayton to do that census. It wasn't God ordered and God ordained. And so Satan rose up and he put in the heart of David to have the census, and David's commander, his army commander, Joab, says, David, this is a really bad idea. Just trust God. He's giving you the victory over and over again. And David says, I don't care what you want, Joab. I want you to go and count the people. So he does that reluctantly. And when he comes back, he gives David a number of 1,100,000 men that are able to go to war, 20 years and older. But Joab, he was so opposed to this, refuses to count the tribe of Benjamin and the tribe of Levi. And so at 1.1 million, he's still way, way short of the men who are able to go to war. Now, if you multiply that number times about 3 or 4, you're up to 4 or 5 million people. Big nation, right? Just like God had promised Abraham. Now, I can't get my head around 4 million people, but I can tell you that here in Harris County, right down the road, in 2019, the census revealed that there was 4.2 million people in Harris County. That's a pretty small square mileage deal, right? It's pretty compacted for 4.2 million people. And most all those people are on the highway anytime I go down to Houston, so I know that they're all there. But we have a large nation. And then on top of that, we have a lot of square mileage. Do you know that the amount of territory that Solomon, we're going to get to Proverbs in just a second, you're going to have to trust me on this, that you know the territory that Solomon was over was a rather huge area. If we started listing all the states in the United States by square mileage, and we went from the ones that had the biggest square mileage to the ones that had the least square mileage, do you know that Israel would be 9 up the list, actually 10 up the list, Connecticut on the bottom, and then Rhode Island and Maryland and others, and then you'd finally come to the size of Israel. So territorially, geographically, this is a huge nation. As a matter of fact, I took a quick look, and in order for us to get the square mileage of how large that territory was that Solomon ruled over, we'd have to combine Harris, Brazoria, Liberty, Matagordo, Montgomery, Fort Bend, Walker, Grimes, Washington, Brazos, Waller, Galveston, Dallas, and Tarrant County to get the same square mileage. I mean, it's a big country, big territory with a bunch of people. Now, I also will tell you that God comes to Solomon and he says, Solomon, what is it that you would ask of me? And, you know, Solomon could have asked for anything, but he said, if you'll give me wisdom. You know why he probably asked for wisdom? Now, he was only about 20 years old. The Bible says he was a child, but you can do the math of how long that David reigned when Solomon was born, and he was about 20 years old when he began to reign. So when he says it was a child, or he was a child, it means that he was immature. He didn't have the maturity. I mean, we really wouldn't want a 20-year-old as a president. Well, we might sometimes, but we don't want a 20-year-old as a president as a general rule. Right? They're just not quite as wise as they need to be. And so Solomon's about 20 years old, and he's going to take on this massive, massive group of people in this huge, huge territory. David says, just a child, help him. And so when God asked him, what can I do for you? He says, if you'll just give me wisdom. And I get that. I'm sure that if it's like my family reunions, I'm sure that he had heard his father David, and he heard his granddad Jesse, and he'd heard all of David's brothers and all his aunts and uncles tell about how rebellious and how disobedient the Israelites had been throughout their history. I'm just confident of that. And he was thinking, man, he said, as a matter of fact, in 1 Chronicles, he says, God, if you'll give me wisdom to rule over these people who are as much as the dust of the earth. Man, a bunch of people. And he says, I need wisdom. And God was so pleased with that request that he didn't ask for armies or wealth, that he gave him all wisdom, and he gave him armies and wealth. And I'll tell you how wise Solomon was. We think he was wise because he wrote the Proverbs. Do you know that if you read 1 Chronicles, it says that he could talk about every plant on earth? That he could explain how plants reproduce. He wasn't just wise with words and with scripture. I mean, this guy was smart in every way. He knew everything. And so when all these people and other kings came in to visit with him, and they'd ask him any question, Solomon could answer it. I mean, he's a smart fella. And so by the time we get to Proverbs, and we know about Proverbs, right? Every culture has Proverbs. We have Proverbs. You ever heard the proverb, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink? You ever heard that? I heard that all my life. It doesn't have anything to do with a horse or any other animal. It simply means that I'll help you as much as I can. But at the end of the day, when I get you as far as I can take you, you're going to have to help yourself. That's what it means. How about haste makes waste? I've been told that all my life. My wife still might use that occasionally. I can solve this conservation issue that you got with killing all these trees and making paper. If they quit publishing those silly instructions and all those booklets that they send with everything that you buy, we wouldn't have that problem because I don't read them nohow. But I finally get around to read them after the screws don't fit and the thing don't work. I finally get there. And haste does make waste, doesn't it? But those are all cultural proverbs, right? They're not necessarily, I mean, they might sound wise. How about ignorance is bliss? That sounds wise, right? I know a lot of people who are living in a lot of bliss. I tell you that straight up. I just tell you that straight. I know a lot of, never mind, I won't say anything more there. I don't have many friends, and the 2 or 3 I got, I want to keep. But the difference about these proverbs is that these proverbs have the Holy Spirit standing behind them. These proverbs are divinely inspired. And so when we read Proverbs, a proverb in the book of Proverbs, it's more than just a cute saying that we can just throw around as slang. It is a standard for wisdom that the Holy Spirit intended for you and for me to have. For we to live our lives by, to provide guidance by. I mean, these are important words in the book of Proverbs. They're not just cute. So, when we get to Proverbs chapter 3, verses 3 and 4, we have a very quick proverb. It says, "Let not mercy and truth forsake you. Bind them, mercy and truth, around your neck. Write them, mercy and truth, on a tablet of your heart. And when you do not forsake mercy and truth, you will have favor with God and with man." You will have favor with God and with man. Now, mercy, if you're looking at any other translation than probably the New King James Version and one other, you're probably looking at loving kindness, compassionate. You're looking at some other word, probably other than mercy. Now, in the Hebrew language, there is a word for mercy that has a formal definition for mercy. But that's not the word that's used in this proverb. The word that is used in this proverb is hesed or chesed. That's the Hebrew. It just depends on which area of the country you're from that speak Hebrew. Would they use Hesed or Hesed? It's spelled Hesed. And it's one of those words that's kind of like glory. I know a formal definition of glory, but if I wanted to explain to you the glory of God, I'd have to talk about a huge concept, right? Well, that's this word mercy. It's a conceptual word. It's used in Exodus, it's used 250 times in the Old Testament, more than 250 times in the Old Testament, actually. And I think of two occasions. One occasion is right after that Moses has smashed the stones because they were worshiping the golden calf that Aaron had created. And he goes back up on the mountaintop. And God says to Moses, I am a God of kindness. I am a God of compassion. I am a God that forgives iniquity. I am a God that grants mercy. I am a God of Hesed. See, I'm a big God that has all of these characteristics and all these traits. That's this word, mercy. Now, I don't know about you. I know about me. And I bet I know something about you. But you know, mercy is not always the first thing I reach for. Do you? It's not the first thing. I mean, when I see somebody who has involved themselves in sin, and sometimes really stupid sin, my first inclination is to say, and they're getting what they deserve. Or how about they brought it on themselves? Or I could have told you so. That's what I reach for. I don't reach for mercy. That's not, see, because mercy is not a natural, intuitive response, no more than sometimes truth is, right? But Solomon says, don't you dare forsake mercy. Grant mercy first before you do anything else. Don't forsake it. Whatever you do, don't forsake it. And then he says you hold on to truth as well. What is this truth here? I have a Facebook account, just so you folks know. I've had a Facebook account for over 20 years. 20, my son's here, he'd tell you it's been a long time. Him and Alyssa set up my Facebook account probably 20 years ago with a password. And about a year ago, I told them I was going to get me a Facebook account. And both of them looked at me kind of stupidly and said, Dad, you've got a Facebook account. You've had it for 20 years. You just have never, ever looked into it. I didn't even know I had one. And I'm not any good at Facebook. I didn't know the difference between unfriending somebody and blocking somebody. If you unfriend somebody, they can see that you don't like them anymore. If you block them, I think that they can't see that you don't like them anymore. I don't know. But I do have a Facebook account, and when we're talking about truth, we're not talking about stuff I see on Facebook from you, brethren, about your opinions. Let that soak for just a minute. We're not talking about that truth. We're talking about truth that's rooted in justice, in walking uprightly, that has no deceit about it. It knows the facts. Have you ever read seriously and consciously the book of Psalms? Have you ever noticed how many times that it says that God hates a deceitful tongue, He hates a lying tongue, He hates those who walk unjustly, He hates those who use weights and use them frivolously and falsely? Have you ever noticed that? Read the book of Psalms and just get you a marker and start marking those down, and you're going to see that God really hates people who have no truth. He just hates them. By the way, I've had to either block or unfriend, whichever one they don't know. I've done that to some of these brethren in this congregation because of some of the things I've read. I've only got about 3 friends. I think I got 3 friends left on Facebook, so it's not too big a deal for me. And those are 3 people I don't know. I just found them by accident. So anyway, there's something about not forsaking mercy and not forsaking truth. And he wants us to wear these 2 attributes around our neck, but not as ornamentation, not self-righteously, but in order to remember that the first thing I reach for is mercy. I have the ability to punish you. I may even have the right to punish you, but I don't. I don't. Now, granting mercy and granting truth, listen to me, granting mercy and granting truth does not override the consequences of sin. Did you hear that? Don't you think for 1 minute that if I grant you mercy and truth that all of a sudden you're going to get by with something. An individual who murders somebody in our society might be highly repentant of the acts that they have committed, but they're going to stand before a jury of their peers and they're going to reap the consequences of their sin. That's the nature of sin. Even in Exodus that I quoted about where he gave the second tablets, he was talking about his goodness and his compassion, his loving kindness. Even God says, but I will visit their iniquity upon them. So nobody gets by with nothing. But if I grant mercy, I'm not standing on top of their head beating them in with those consequences. I'm consoling. I'm helping as they go through those consequences. And let me just say something else here as we get right to the end of this thing. Let me just say to you that mercy without truth, you do nobody any good by not telling them the truth. Do not come to me and pat me on my back and say it's going to be okay when you know that I have sinned a sin where it is not going to be okay. Don't lie to me. Mercy without truth is nothing more than pity. Nothing more than pity. Mercy and truth are not opposed to each other. They're complementary to each other. When I was in school preaching, I preached a couple of Sundays a month in Muleshoe, Texas. They had a real full-time minister, Elmer Evans, a good friend of mine. He's dead now. But Elmer was an older gentleman. He was a home builder. He wasn't even formally educated in the Bible, but he knew the book. And he was a pretty good little speaker. But they wanted a little bit of help, and they knew students needed support, so they asked me to come out there and preach twice a month on Sundays. And I did. And after one of the morning services, one of the good families there, mom and dad, asked me to go to lunch with them. And they had 4 kids, but the only kid that was with us when we got to the restaurant was their daughter. Their daughter had just turned 17. I'm talking she hadn't been 17. She wasn't 17 by 3 weeks. And I could tell that this was not just a casual lunch. You know where I'm going with this, right? And mom and daddy began to tell me that their daughter had been involved in sex, and she is now pregnant, and they wanted me to perform a wedding ceremony for their daughter and for this young man. This young man was not a member of the church, nor his parents. And they wanted me to grant some mercy here and alleviate the burden of the sin of their daughter. And I refrained from doing that. I eventually did marry him about 6 or 7 months later. But I wanted to get to the truth with them before I granted mercy. And there wasn't no way for that young lady to avoid the consequences of her sin, right? I mean, she's as pregnant can be. And so mercy and truth don't dispel consequences of sin, but it's how we respond. It's how we respond to people's pain and people's hurt, people's circumstances. That Solomon says we ought to do it with mercy and with truth. Now, I need to wear them around my neck in some form or another because it's not my first inclination. And if I do that, I will have favor with God and man. Do you remember in Luke chapter 2 where it says that Jesus gained favor with God and man? Remember that? Having favor with God and man doesn't mean it's going to be easy. If there's anybody in this audience who thinks that Jesus' life was easy, see me after the service this morning. His life was not easy, but it says he had favor with God and man. In other words, God loved him for his commitment to truth. And the men, even though they hated him, saw his consistency about truth. And as many times they tried to trick him, he never once tripped because he held on to truth. Final thing I want to say this morning, as it relates to this proverb, don't forsake mercy and truth. Put it around your neck. And God and man will treat you right. There's a lot of characters in the Bible. There's a bunch of characters in the Bible. a bunch of bad characters in the Bible. There's a bunch of good characters in the Bible. And I've said this a jillion times in my life. Boy, if I could just be like old David, a man after God's own heart. You ever said that? You ever thought that? Sure you have, right? And that's not a bad thing. I'm not belittling that. David had a pile of sins, and he was a mess, and yet he loved the Lord. And he repented repeatedly. Cost him his son sometimes, cost him battles sometimes. He paid the penalty for his sin, but he repented. He loved the Lord. But you know, what if I could convince you, and I intend to convince you, that mercy and truth, while they were probably characteristics of David, are the very attributes of God Himself. I mean, there's a character you got to hold on to, right? God Himself is a merciful and truthful God. I mean, He's full of mercy. We always say, well, mercy is not getting what you deserve. Grace is getting something you don't deserve. Well, that's all fine and good, but I'm telling you, this guy is one merciful God. He not only is merciful to me and you, He's merciful in other areas of the universe I can't even describe, don't even know about. And He is so full of truth. And so if you decide that you might want to embrace this proverb that is divinely inspired and that represents the very character of God Himself, you do yourself well. You're not going to hurt yourself by deciding to sign up for mercy and for truth. You're just not going to hurt yourself in any way. But I'm telling you, mercy and truth isn't always the first thing I reach for. And I bet it's not for you either. I bet it's not for you either. Kind of have to learn it a little bit. Kind of have to learn it a little bit. I have no idea what your needs are today. I have no idea what's going on in your life. I've got my own problems. And since I have problems, and I think I'm pretty stable at 67, I know that you've got to have some issues. One thing about living out on the ranch, I get to talk to my God anytime I want to. I mean, tending cows, cutting a pasture, plowing a field, pretty simple task. And so we talk often and we talk about anything we want to talk about. We chat all the time. And He knows that I need help with mercy. And He knows I need to strengthen truth in my life. He knows that. And if you need that this morning and there's some way that we can facilitate those characteristics in you through prayer or conversation, we would love to do that. We would just love to do that. And so you're welcome to come and ask for that help as together we stand and sing.